Welcome back to Revenge Room. Today's story is called My Daughter-in-Law Drugged My Whiskey to Steal My Ranch. My butler spilled it, and what happened next will shock you. Imagine this. You spent 40 years of your life building something from nothing. A ranch worth $4 million. Every fence post, every acre, every sunrise and sunset you earned with your own two hands alongside the woman you loved. And after she passed away, you thought your family would protect what you built together. You were wrong. Your daughter-in-law pours you a glass of whiskey with a smile that doesn't reach her eyes. She says, "Drink up, old man, it will make you feel better." And just as you raise that glass to your lips, your butler, a man who has worked beside you for decades, accidentally knocks it from your hand. The whiskey spills across the floor. Your daughter-in-law's face twists with rage for just a second before she hides it. And then your butler leans close and whispers 5 words that change everything. Do not touch it. Trust me. What was in that glass? Why did your butler risk everything to stop you? And what happens when you discover your daughter-in-law has done this before? To another old man who did not survive, if you skip ahead or leave now, you will miss the most jaw-dropping, satisfying revenge you have ever witnessed. The twist coming will leave you speechless, and the ending, pure justice that will make you want to stand up and cheer. Stay until the very end, because sometimes the quietest revenge is the most devastating. This is Revenge Room. Let us begin. My name is Franklin Moore. I am 69 years old, a rancher who spent 4 decades turning empty Colorado land into something worth fighting for. My wife Margaret and I built this place from nothing, and now 3 years after cancer took her from me, I water her roses every morning and pretend I can still hear her voice in the wind. The morning sun was just breaking over the mountains when I stepped onto the porch with my coffee, same as I had done for 40 years. The ranch stretched out before me, 4,000 acres of grassland and timber horses grazing in the distance, the old barn Margaret and I had rebuilt together after the fire of '94. People in town said the property was worth $4 million now, maybe more. But they did not understand that you cannot put a price on 40 years of backbreaking work, on the memory of your wife's laughter echoing across the fields, on the blood and sweat soaked into every fence post and every inch of soil. I walked down to Margaret's rose garden, the watering can heavy in my hand. She had planted these roses the year we got married, red ones for passion, white ones for peace. I talked to her while I watered them the way I did every morning. Told her about the weather, about how the horses were doing, about how much I missed her. Some people might call that crazy. I called it the only conversation worth having anymore. The truth was, loneliness had become my closest companion since Margaret passed. My son Lucas used to visit every week. Now, it was once a month if I was lucky, and even then the visits felt different, shorter, colder. His wife Vanessa did most of the talking, and her words always seemed to circle back to the same topic: the ranch, my health, my future. She asked questions that felt less like concern and more like inventory. How are you feeling? Franklin, have you thought about what happens to this place when you are gone? Do you really need all this space at your age? I had become invisible in my own family. A problem to be managed rather than a father to be loved. Walter found me in the rose garden that morning, same as he did most days. He had been my ranch manager for nearly 30 years, a quiet man with steady hands and eyes that missed nothing. He was 64 now, still strong, still sharp, still the most reliable person in my life. When he placed his hand on my shoulder, there was something protective in the gesture, something that went beyond the relationship between employer and employee. It was the way a soldier might guard a brother in arms. I noticed it, but did not understand it, not then. That evening, Lucas and Vanessa arrived for what Vanessa called a family dinner. She walked through my front door like she already owned the place, her eyes scanning the room, appraising, calculating. Lucas followed behind her, quiet, as always, his shoulders slightly hunched like a man carrying a weight he could not name. Vanessa smiled at me, but the warmth never reached her eyes. Over dinner, she steered the conversation exactly where I knew she would. "Franklin," she said, leaning forward with practiced concern, "have you thought about simplifying your life? This ranch is so much work for one person. Maybe it is time to transfer it to Lucas. Keep it in the family. Let yourself rest." I glanced at the framed photograph on the wall, the one from the Colorado Veterans Foundation gala Margaret and I had attended years ago. She had squeezed my hand that night and whispered, "If we never have grandchildren who deserve this place, promise me it will go to people who actually sacrificed for something." I had promised. I always kept my promises to her. I told Vanessa I would think about it. She smiled again, that same cold smile, and said she knew I would make the right decision. After dinner, we moved to the living room. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting long shadows across the walls Margaret had decorated with so much love. Lucas sat silently in the corner, staring at his hands. And then Vanessa stood up, walked to her bag, and pulled out a bottle of whiskey I had never seen before. "Let us celebrate family," she said, her voice smooth as silk. "I brought something special just for you, Franklin." She poured a glass and held it out to me, her eyes never leaving my face. That night, Vanessa suggested we open a special bottle of whiskey to celebrate family. I had never seen that bottle before in my life. The bottle was dark amber, the label elegant but unfamiliar. I had been drinking whiskey for 50 years and knew every decent brand from Kentucky to Scotland, but this one I had never seen. Vanessa held it like a trophy, turning it slowly so the firelight caught the glass, her smile fixed and patient as she waited for my reaction. I should have said no. I should have told her I was tired, that I didn't feel like drinking, that my doctor had warned me about alcohol. But something in her eyes made me hesitate. There was a challenge there, buried beneath the false warmth, and some stubborn part of me refused to back down in my own home. So I nodded and she poured. She filled my glass with exaggerated care, tilting the bottle slowly, making sure I watched every drop. Then she poured smaller amounts for herself and Lucas before raising her glass toward me. Her voice was honey over broken glass. "To Franklin," she said, "may your remaining years be peaceful and simple." She paused on that last word, let it hang in the air like smoke. Simple. The way she said it made it sound like an insult, like she was toasting to a man already half in the grave, too old and feeble to matter anymore. Lucas raised his glass without meeting my eyes. I raised mine and brought it to my lips. The first sip told me something was wrong. The whiskey had a bitter edge beneath the oak and caramel, something metallic that lingered on my tongue like a warning. I swallowed and felt a faint burn that seemed sharper than it should have been, different from any whiskey I had ever tasted. I was about to mention it, about to ask Vanessa what brand this was and where she had found it, when I caught her watching me. She was staring with an intensity that made my skin prickle. Her eyes were fixed on my glass on my throat, tracking every swallow with the focus of a hawk watching a rabbit. Her fingers tapped against the armrest of her chair in a quick, impatient rhythm, and there was something in her posture that reminded me of a gambler waiting for dice to land. She wanted something. She was waiting for something, and whatever it was, it had to do with that glass in my hand. I set the whiskey down on the side table, suddenly not thirsty anymore. Lucas cleared his throat, breaking the strange tension in the room. "Where did you get this whiskey anyway?" he asked, his tone casual but curious. "It is not a brand I recognize." Vanessa's head snapped toward him so fast, I thought she might have hurt her neck. "Do not worry about it," she said, her voice sharp as a slap. The flash of temper was startling, completely out of proportion to such an innocent question. For just a moment, her mask slipped, and I saw something cold and hard underneath something that looked almost like fear. Then she caught herself, forced her shoulders to relax, and smiled again. "I found it at a specialty shop in Denver," she added, softer now, dismissive. "It is supposed to be very smooth, good for older palates." There it was again, that subtle dig at my age wrapped in false concern. I looked at Lucas, expecting him to react to his wife's outburst, but he just stared at his own glass with an expression I couldn't read. He looked uncomfortable. He looked like a man who wanted to be anywhere else in the world. The moment stretched awkward and heavy until Walter appeared in the doorway. He had come to clear the dinner dishes, a task he had performed thousands of times over the years. He moved through the room with his usual quiet efficiency, stacking plates, gathering silverware, his weathered hands steady and sure. I had almost forgotten about the whiskey when it happened. Walter reached across the side table for an empty water glass, and his elbow caught my whiskey. The glass tumbled off the edge and shattered on the hardwood floor, amber liquid spreading across the boards like a stain. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Moore," Walter said immediately, his voice calm and apologetic. "How clumsy of me. Let me clean that up right away." But I was not looking at Walter. I was looking at Vanessa. Her face had transformed in the split second after the glass fell. Her features contorted with rage, her lips pulling back, her eyes blazing with a fury so intense it took my breath away. She looked like she wanted to leap across the room and strangle Walter with her bare hands. Then, just as quickly, the mask slammed back into place. She forced a laugh that sounded like breaking glass. "Oh no, what a shame," she said, her voice bright and brittle. "That was the last of the bottle, too. What a waste." A waste. That was the word she chose. Not an accident, not bad luck. A waste. Walter knelt to pick up the broken glass, and for just a moment his eyes met mine. There was something in his gaze I had never seen before, something urgent and serious. A warning I could feel in my bones even if I did not understand it. He held my eyes for half a second, maybe less, then looked away and continued cleaning. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of forced conversation and uncomfortable silences. Vanessa made excuses about an early morning, and within an hour she and Lucas were gone, their taillights disappearing down the long driveway into the darkness. I stood on the porch and watched them go, my mind churning with questions I could not answer. The bitter taste of that whiskey still lingered on my tongue. I was in my study an hour later, sitting in Margaret's favorite chair, staring at the cold fireplace and trying to make sense of what had happened. The door opened and Walter stepped inside. He closed it behind him, then moved to each window, checking that they were shut and the curtains drawn. His movements were deliberate, almost military, and when he finally turned to face me, his expression was the most serious I had ever seen. He crossed the room, leaned close, and whispered 5 words that changed everything. "Do not drink anything she gives you." I stared at Walter, his words hanging in the air between us like a verdict. The study suddenly felt smaller, the shadows deeper, the silence heavier than it had any right to be. My mouth was dry, and I could still taste that bitter metallic edge on my tongue, could still feel where the whiskey had burned going down. "What are you talking about?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Walter glanced at the door one more time, then pulled a chair close to mine and sat down. His movements were slow and deliberate, the way a man moves when he is about to deliver news that will change everything. He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his weathered hands clasped together. "I have been watching her, Mr. Moore, for months now. At first I thought I was imagining things, seeing shadows where there were none, but I have seen enough in my life to know when someone is planning something dark." He told me what he had observed, how Vanessa had started asking questions about my health whenever she visited, questions that seemed innocent on the surface but always circled back to the same themes: my heart, my blood pressure, my medications. She had asked Walter once if I ever forgot to take my pills, if I ever seemed confused or disoriented. He had thought it strange at the time but said nothing. Then there were the searches. Walter had walked into the living room one afternoon while Vanessa was on her laptop, and she had slammed it shut so fast she nearly broke the screen. But not before he caught a glimpse of what she had been reading. Medical articles about cardiac medications, drug interactions, symptoms of heart failure in elderly men. "And that whiskey," Walter continued, his voice low and urgent. "I saw her bring it into the house yesterday during her solo visit to town. She hid it in her bag like contraband. When I asked what it was, she told me it was none of my concern. The way she said it, Mr. Moore, cold as ice. That woman is planning something, and whatever it is, it ends with you in the ground." I sat back in my chair, my mind racing. Part of me wanted to dismiss what he was saying, wanted to believe that my son's wife could not possibly be capable of something so monstrous. But I remembered the way she had watched me drink, the impatient tapping of her fingers, the rage that had flashed across her face when the glass shattered. I remembered the taste of that whiskey, bitter and wrong. Still, one question burned brighter than all the others. "Walter?" I said slowly, "Why do you care this much? You are putting yourself at risk by telling me this. If Vanessa found out, if Lucas found out, you could lose your job. You could lose everything. Why would you do that for me?" Walter went quiet. For a long moment he just sat there staring at his hands, and I saw something shift in his expression. The professional distance he had always maintained seemed to crack, revealing something deeper underneath, something that looked almost like pain. He sat down heavily, as if the weight of what he was about to say was too much to carry, standing up. "Do you remember the fire, Mr. Moore, 1994? The old barn on the east side of the property?" I frowned, searching my memory. "The fire." Yes, I remembered it vaguely. A spark from faulty wiring, the hay going up like kindling flames, roaring so loud you could barely hear yourself think. We had lost the barn but saved the horses. It was a blur of smoke and chaos in my mind, one of 100 emergencies that came with running a ranch for 40 years. I remember I said, "We rebuilt it the following spring." Walter nodded, but his eyes were distant, seeing something I could not. "My daughter was in that barn," he said quietly. "Sarah, She was 8 years old. She had been playing in the hayloft when the fire started, and by the time we realized she was missing, the whole structure was engulfed. The other hands ran for water, for the hose, for anything. But you did not hesitate. You ran straight into those flames like a man possessed. The memory came back to me then, hazy and fragmented. The heat so intense it felt like walking into the sun. The smoke so thick I could not see my own hands. A child screaming somewhere above me. I had not thought, had not calculated the risks. I had simply moved. I carried her out. I said the words coming slowly as the images reassembled in my mind. She was unconscious from the smoke. You carried her out, Walter repeated. And you nearly died doing it. You have scars on your back, Mr. Moore. Burns that never fully healed. I see them every time I help you with the hay, every time you take your shirt off to wash up by the pump. You probably forgot about them. But I never did. My daughter is a doctor now, working at a hospital in Denver, saving lives every single day. She exists because of you. Her children will exist because of you. His voice cracked slightly, and he paused to collect himself. I swore that day, he continued, that if I ever had the chance to repay what you did for me, I would take it without hesitation. I have been waiting 30 years, Mr. Moore, 30 years to return the favor, and I'm not going to stand by and watch that woman take you from this world. You gave me back my family. I will not let anyone take yours. I did not know what to say. The fire had been instinct, nothing more. I had not thought of myself as a hero then, and I did not think of myself as one now. But Walter had carried that moment with him for 3 decades, had shaped his entire life around a debt he felt he owed. I reached out and gripped his shoulder. Then, we need a plan, I said. If she is really doing what you think she is doing, we need proof, and we need time to gather it. Walter nodded, his jaw set with determination. Play weak, he said. Let her think she is winning. The more confident she gets, the more careless she will become. So that was what I decided to do. I would become the feeble old man Vanessa already believed me to be. I would shuffle and stammer and forget things. I would let her underestimate me completely. And while she was busy celebrating her victory, Walter and I would be watching, listening, gathering every shred of evidence we needed to expose her. The next morning, I shuffled into the kitchen with exaggerated stiffness. Vanessa was there, sipping coffee, her eyes sharp as always. I let my voice tremble, let my hands shake slightly as I reached for a mug. Vanessa, dear, I said, I've been thinking about what you said. Maybe it is time to discuss the ranch. Her smile was the coldest thing I had ever seen. The performance began that very morning and continued for the next 2 weeks. I became an actor in my own home, playing the role of a man slipping slowly into senility. I asked the same questions twice within minutes. I called Walter by the wrong name, then apologized with confusion in my eyes. I searched for my reading glasses while they sat in my shirt pocket, patting my pockets and squinting at tables, until Vanessa would sigh and point them out with barely concealed irritation. It was exhausting work pretending to be weak when every instinct screamed at me to fight. But Walter had been right. The more feeble I appeared, the more careless Vanessa became. Her contempt grew with each passing day. At first, she had maintained the pretense of concern, speaking to me in that honeyed voice that never quite reached her eyes. But as my confusion seemed to deepen, she stopped bothering with the mask. She began talking about me in the third person, even when I was sitting right there in the room. He forgot to take his pills again this morning, she would say to Lucas over breakfast, as if I were a piece of furniture. I do not know how much longer he can manage on his own. It is really quite sad watching someone deteriorate like this. I sat there and said nothing, chewing my toast, slowly playing the part of a man too lost in the fog to notice the insult. Inside, I was taking notes. One evening during dinner, Lucas excused himself to use the bathroom. I watched him go and something caught my attention. As he passed through the doorway, he reached into his jacket and pulled out a small leather notebook. His movements were quick and furtive, the way a man moves when he does not want to be seen. He scribbled something rapidly, then tucked the notebook away and disappeared down the hall. When he returned a few minutes later, our eyes met briefly across the table. There was something in his expression I could not quite read. Guilt, perhaps, or shame. He looked away, first reaching for his water glass, and said nothing for the rest of the meal. I filed the moment away in my memory, another piece of a puzzle I did not yet understand. 2 days later, I heard something I was not supposed to hear. Vanessa had stepped out onto the back porch to make a phone call, thinking I was napping in my study. but I'd learned to move quietly, and I stood just inside the screen door. My phone in my hand, the voice recorder running. "Everything is on schedule," she said, her voice low and confident. "The old man is losing it fast. You should see him wandering around, looking for his glasses, forgetting conversations we had 10 minutes ago. By spring, we will have full control. The doctors will declare him incompetent, and Lucas will have power of attorney. After that, it is just paperwork." She laughed at something the other person said, a cold sound that made my blood run slow. I saved the recording and slipped back to my study before she returned. That night at dinner, I decided to test something. I mentioned as casually as I could manage that I had been thinking about calling Margaret's old friend Evelyn Hart. She was a lawyer, I explained, helped us with our estate planning years ago. Very sharp woman. I have not talked to her in years, but maybe I should reach out just to make sure everything is in order. Vanessa's fork paused halfway to her mouth. Her eyes flickered with something that might have been alarm before she smoothed her expression into a dismissive smile. "Oh, Franklin," she said, "there is no need to bother with lawyers. Family should handle family matters. Besides, you do not want to confuse yourself with all that legal jargon. Lucas and I can take care of everything." I nodded slowly, playing the part of the agreeable old man, but her reaction told me everything I needed to know. She did not want me talking to lawyers. She did not want anyone examining the paperwork too closely. Later that same evening, Vanessa mentioned her stepfather for the first time. We were sitting in the living room, and she was flipping through a magazine, making idle conversation about nothing in particular. "My stepfather had a ranch," once she said, her tone casual and almost bored. "Nothing as grand as this, of course. He left everything to my mother when he died. Heart attack at 58, very sudden. Some people just are not built to last." She said it the way someone might comment on the weather. No grief, no nostalgia, just a flat statement of fact. A man had died and left her family everything, and she spoke of it like a business transaction completed long ago. I made a small sound of sympathy and said nothing else, but my mind was racing. 58 years old, sudden heart attack, everything left to her mother. I thought about the bitter whiskey, about the medical research on her laptop, about her impatience to gain control of my ranch. A pattern was beginning to emerge, faint but unmistakable, like tracks in fresh snow. That afternoon, I told Walter I needed to run errands in town. He offered to drive me, but I insisted on going alone, playing up my stubborn independence as part of the act. The truth was, I needed to do something without any witnesses. I drove to town for the first time in months, my hands steady on the wheel despite the performance I had been giving. I parked outside a small law office on Main Street, a place I had not visited in 7 years, not since Margaret and I had last updated our wills. The brass nameplate beside the door read Hart and Associates. I walked in and the receptionist looked up from her desk. Her eyes widened slightly with recognition. "Mr. Moore," she said, her voice tinged with something that sounded almost like relief. "Mrs. Hart has been expecting your call. She said you would come eventually." The receptionist led me down a narrow hallway lined with legal books and framed certificates. At the end, she opened a heavy oak door and gestured me inside. The office was exactly what I would have expected from a woman like Evelyn Hart, organized, elegant, and utterly without pretense. Behind a mahogany desk sat a silver-haired woman with sharp eyes that seemed to take my measure in a single glance. Evelyn stood and came around the desk to greet me. She was in her early 60s, tall and composed, every inch the lawyer who would not suffer fools. When she shook my hand, her grip was firm, her gaze direct. I could see immediately why Margaret had trusted her. "Franklin," she said, her voice warm but serious, "please sit down. I've been waiting for this visit for 3 years. She and Margaret had been college roommates." She explained, settling back into her chair. They had remained close throughout their lives, confiding in each other about everything from marriages to careers, to the small worries that accumulated over the years. When Margaret got sick, Evelyn had visited, often sitting by her bedside, listening to her concerns about the future. "Your wife called me 6 months before she passed," Evelyn said, folding her hands on the desk. She was worried about Vanessa even then. She said there was something cold behind that woman's smile, something calculating. Margaret did not have proof of anything, just instinct. But her instincts were rarely wrong. I nodded slowly, my throat tight. Margaret had always been the perceptive one, the one who could read people like open books, while I stumbled through social situations with the grace of a bull in a china shop. If she had sensed something wrong with Vanessa years ago, I should have paid more attention. Evelyn opened a drawer and pulled out a thick folder. She laid it on the desk between us and tapped it with one finger. "This is what Margaret asked me to prepare," she said. "A revocable living trust with very specific provisions. She wanted to make sure that if anything ever happened to you, if you were ever declared mentally incompetent, for any reason the ranch and all your assets would be protected." She opened the folder and turned it so I could see the documents inside. The legal language was dense, but Evelyn translated it into plain English. "If you are ever declared incompetent," she explained, "control of the trust does not transfer to Lucas or any other family member. It transfers to me." Margaret was very clear about that. She did not want anyone in your family to have the ability to make decisions about your estate without independent oversight. I stared at the papers, stunned. Margaret had done this without telling me, had built a fortress around our life's work while I was oblivious. She had loved me enough to protect me from threats I could not even see. "There is more," Evelyn continued. "The trust includes a no-contest clause. If any beneficiary attempts fraud, coercion, or undue influence against you, they forfeit their inheritance entirely. Every penny, every acre gone. Margaret wanted to make sure that if anyone ever tried to manipulate you, they would lose everything in the attempt." I thought about Vanessa's phone call about her confident prediction that she would have full control by spring. She had no idea what she was walking into. Evelyn reached across the desk and picked up another document, a photocopy of legal paperwork covered in handwritten notes. "I obtained this from a contact at the county courthouse," she said. "Your daughter-in-law has been busy. She is preparing to file for guardianship, claiming you are mentally incompetent and unable to manage your own affairs. Once that goes through, she believes Lucas will have power of attorney over everything. She does not know about the trust provisions. Margaret kept them private deliberately. The guardianship trap. That was what Vanessa had been planning all along. The whiskey, the performance of concern, the subtle campaign to make me look confused and feeble. It was all building toward a courtroom where a judge would sign away my autonomy and hand my life to the woman trying to end it." Evelyn paused. Then her expression troubled. She set down the document and looked at me with something that might have been reluctance. "Franklin, there is something else. When Margaret first expressed concerns about Vanessa, I did some preliminary research, background checks, public records, that sort of thing. I found something that bothered me then, and it bothers me more now." She pulled another sheet from the folder. "Vanessa's stepfather," she said quietly. "A man named Robert Dawson. He died 8 years ago. Heart failure. He was 58 years old and by all accounts perfectly healthy. No history of cardiac problems, no warning signs. He simply collapsed one day and never woke up. My blood went cold. The same age, the same sudden death that Vanessa had mentioned so casually over dinner. Some people just are not built to last. He left everything to Vanessa's mother," Evelyn continued, "who then spent quite liberally with Vanessa's guidance. Expensive trips, luxury purchases, investments that went nowhere. Within 3 years, the entire estate was gone and Vanessa's mother died in debt. Vanessa walked away clean. She let the implication hang in the air between us, heavy and terrible. I did not need her to spell it out. The pattern was clear now, written in money and death and convenient timing. "I will investigate further," Evelyn said firmly. "I have contacts who can dig deeper into Robert Dawson's death, look for anything the original investigation might have missed. In the meantime, you need to keep doing exactly what you have been doing. Play the confused old man. Let Vanessa think she is winning. And let your man Walter collect whatever evidence he can about these poisoning attempts. We will need it all before this is over." I stood to leave, my mind churning with everything I had learned. At the door, I turned back to thank her, but Evelyn spoke first. "Franklin," she called after me, her voice softer now. "Margaret left something else for you, but she made me promise to only give it to you when you truly needed it. I think the time is coming soon." 3 days passed before Vanessa made her next move. I had been waiting for it, watching her every gesture and expression for signs of impatience, and I could see the tension building behind her carefully constructed mask. She needed me to deteriorate faster. She needed results. It came in the form of herbal tea. I was sitting in the living room that afternoon, pretending to doze in my armchair, when Vanessa appeared with a steaming cup. She set it on the side table beside me with exaggerated gentleness, her voice dripping with false concern. "I made you some tea, Franklin," she said sweetly. "Herbal blend, very soothing. Good for your heart. Good for your heart." The words sent ice through my veins, but I kept my expression slack, my eyes unfocused. I mumbled a thank you and reached for the cup with trembling hands, part of the performance I had perfected over the past weeks. Vanessa watched me raise it to my lips, that same predatory intensity in her gaze that I had seen the night of the whiskey. I let the liquid touch my lips but didn't swallow. The moment she turned to adjust the curtains, I spat into a napkin and tucked it into my pocket. Even that brief contact was enough to taste the bitterness beneath the chamomile-sharpened chemical. Within minutes, my heart began to race, a flutter in my chest that felt wrong and unnatural. Whatever she had put in that tea, even the residue on my lips, was enough to affect me. I played my part. I complained of dizziness, pressing my hand to my forehead and asking Vanessa to repeat herself several times. When I stood to walk to the bathroom, I stumbled against the doorframe and caught myself with exaggerated clumsiness. Vanessa rushed to help me, her hand steadying my arm. But I saw the satisfaction she could barely contain. Her eyes were bright with triumph. Later that evening, I overheard her talking to Lucas in the kitchen. Her voice was low but excited, carrying through the walls with the confidence of someone who believes they are winning. "It is working faster than I expected," she said. "Did you see him today? He could barely stand. At this rate, we will not have to wait until spring." Lucas said something. I couldn't hear, his voice too soft to penetrate the walls, but Vanessa's response was clear enough. "Do not get cold feet now. We are too close. Just keep your mouth shut and let me handle everything." I retreated to my study and found Walter waiting for me. Without a word, I handed him the napkin and the cup I had managed to retrieve from the living room. He examined them with grim focus, then nodded. "I know someone," he said quietly. "Retired toxicologist, lives on the other side of town. Discreet and trustworthy. If there is something in this, he will find it. Results in about 2 weeks. 2 weeks felt like an eternity, but I understood the necessity. We needed proof, not suspicions. We needed evidence that would hold up in court, that would expose Vanessa for what she truly was. Until then, I would continue to play the dying fool. That night, Evelyn called. I took the phone into Margaret's rose garden, away from the house and any ears that might be listening. Her voice was measured but tense, the voice of a lawyer who had uncovered something she wished she had not. "I have been digging into Robert Dawson's death," she said. "The more I find, the worse it looks. He died of sudden cardiac arrest 8 years ago, despite having no history of heart problems whatsoever. His physician was interviewed after the death and noted that it was completely unexpected. Dawson had passed a physical just 3 months earlier with perfect results." She paused, and I heard papers shuffling on her end of the line. "The estate was worth $800,000, she continued. "Everything went to Vanessa's mother, just as Vanessa mentioned. But here's where it gets interesting. Within 2 years of Dawson's death, almost all of that money was gone, depleted through a series of investments that Vanessa personally recommended. Bad stocks, failed business ventures, money that simply vanished into accounts that could not be traced. And her mother, I asked already knowing the answer, died in debt 2 years after her husband. Heart failure as well, though she had a history of anxiety and stress that could explain it, or could provide convenient cover. The pattern was emerging now, clear and terrible. Vanessa did not simply marry into wealthy families, she hunted them. She found older men with assets, ingratiated herself through marriage or family connection, then used slow methods to drain their health and their wealth. By the time anyone thought to ask questions, she had already moved on to the next target. Franklin was not her first victim. He might be her third. "You need to be very careful," Evelyn said, her voice dropping to barely a whisper. "I spoke with Robert Dawson's former doctor this afternoon. I told him about your symptoms, the dizziness, the racing heart, the confusion. He said something that made my blood run cold." "What did he say?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When Evelyn spoke again, I could hear the fear in her voice. Fear for me. Fear of what we were uncovering. "He said the symptoms you described are identical to what Robert Dawson experienced in the weeks before he died." I barely slept that night. Evelyn's words echoed in my mind like a death sentence being read aloud. The symptoms were identical. Whatever had killed Robert Dawson was now coursing through my own veins, administered drop by drop in whiskey and tea by a woman who smiled while she poisoned me. But beneath the fear, something else was growing. A cold determination. If Vanessa thought she could take me the way she had taken Dawson, she was gravely mistaken. The next morning, I watched from my study window as Vanessa's car disappeared down the driveway. She had announced at breakfast that she needed to run errands in town, her voice light and casual as if she were not plotting murder between shopping trips. I waited until the dust from her tires had settled, then went to find my son. Lucas was sitting on the back porch staring at nothing. He looked worse than I had ever seen him, thinner, older, the shadows under his eyes dark as bruises. His hands wrapped around a coffee cup that had long gone cold, and when he heard my footsteps, he flinched before turning around. "You wanted to talk, Dad?" he said, his voice flat and tired. His eyes would not meet mine. I sat down in the chair beside him, close enough to speak quietly, but not close enough to touch. For a long moment, I said nothing, just looked at my son and tried to see the boy I'd raised, the child Margaret and I had loved and hoped for and dreamed about. He was still in there somewhere, buried beneath years of weakness and wrong choices. "Lucas," I said finally, "are you happy?" The question hung in the air between us. It was not an accusation, not a confrontation, just a simple question that any father might ask his son. But something in those 4 words broke through whatever walls Lucas had built around himself. His composure crumbled. His face contorted, and for a terrible moment I thought he might shatter completely. He set down the coffee cup because his hands were shaking too badly to hold it, and when he finally spoke, his voice cracked like dry wood. "I have not been happy in years, Dad." He pressed his palms against his eyes, his shoulders hunching forward. "I am scared. I am so scared of her." The confession poured out of him, then a flood of words that had been dammed up for far too long. He told me he had known about Vanessa's plans for months. He had watched her research medications on her laptop late at night, had heard fragments of phone calls she thought were private, had seen the calculations in her eyes whenever she looked at me. He knew what she was doing. He knew what she was capable of, but he had been too afraid to act. "I was afraid of losing her," he said, his voice raw with shame. "She is the only woman who ever made me feel like I mattered, and I was afraid of what she might do to me if I betrayed her. You have seen how she looks at people who get in her way, that coldness. I could not face it being directed at me. I listened without interrupting my heart breaking and hardening at the same time. My son had watched his wife try to murder me and had done nothing. He had chosen his own comfort over my life. Part of me wanted to shake him, to scream at him, to ask how he could have let this happen. But another part of me saw the terror in his eyes and recognized it for what it was. Lucas was not evil. He was weak. He was a coward who had made cowardly choices, and now he was drowning in the consequences. "There is something else," Lucas said, his voice dropping to barely a whisper. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a worn leather notebook, its cover creased and softened from handling. I could not stop her, but I could not pretend I did not see. He held the notebook out to me with trembling hands. "I have been writing everything down for 2 years. Dates, conversations, things I saw her do. I took photographs of documents she tried to hide. I do not know why I did it. Maybe I thought someday I would be brave enough to use it. Maybe I just needed proof that I was not crazy, that what I was seeing was real." I took the notebook from him and opened it to the first page. The handwriting was my son's, but shaky, uncertain, the letters of a man whose hands trembled as he wrote. The entries were dated meticulously, each one a small window into the horror that had been unfolding in my own home. The evidence was staggering. Dates when Vanessa had researched specific medications, transcripts of phone calls Lucas had overheard, photographs of financial documents and legal papers she had prepared in secret, 2 years of meticulous documentation, a paper trail that led directly to attempted murder. But what struck me most was not the evidence itself. It was the desperation I could see in my son's handwriting, the way the entries became more frantic as time went on. Lucas was not purely a villain in this story. He was a coward with a conscience, a man who had lacked the courage to do the right thing, but could not bring himself to look away entirely. He had been trapped by his own weakness, watching a nightmare unfold and recording it because he did not know what else to do. I closed the notebook and looked at my son. He was weeping now. Silent tears streaming down his face, his shoulders shaking with suppressed sobs. He looked like a man who had been carrying a weight too heavy for him and had finally set it down. I did not embrace him. I could not. Not yet, maybe not ever. "You knew Lucas," I said quietly. "You knew what she was doing, and you did nothing while she tried to kill me." "I know, Dad," he whispered. "I know. I stood up and walked back into the house, the notebook clutched in my hand. Behind me, I could hear my son crying, but I did not turn around. There would be time later for forgiveness or condemnation. Right now, I had work to do. That night, alone in my study, I opened the notebook to the first entry. It was dated 2 years ago. Today, V asked me how much Dad's ranch is worth. She smiled when I told her. That smile scared me. I turned to the last entry dated just yesterday. I think she's going to kill him soon. God forgive me, I do not know how to stop her. I spent the night reading through Lucas's notebook page by page, entry by entry. Each word was another nail in Vanessa's coffin, another piece of evidence that would help bring her down. But it was also a chronicle of my son's cowardice, his fear, his inability to act even when he knew his own father's life was at stake. By morning, I had finished the notebook and set it aside. I felt exhausted, heartsick, and more determined than I had ever been in my life. Evelyn arrived just after noon. I saw her car coming up the driveway and met her on the porch before she could knock. She was carrying something in her hands, a small wooden box, polished oak with brass hinges, the kind of box you might use to store something precious. She did not smile when she saw me. Her expression was solemn, almost reverent, as if she were delivering something sacred. "Franklin," she said quietly, "I told you Margaret left something for you, something she made me promise to only give you when the time was right." She held out the box. I took it, feeling its weight in my hands, and looked at her questioningly. "She gave me this 4 months before she died." Evelyn continued, "Made me swear to only deliver it when someone threatened everything you two built together. She said I would know when that time came." She paused, her eyes meeting mine. "I think we both know that time is now." I thanked her, my voice thick, and she left without another word. She understood that whatever was in this box was meant for me alone, a final message from my wife that had been waiting 3 years to be heard. I retreated to my study and locked the door behind me. The afternoon light filtered through the curtains, casting long shadows across Margaret's favorite chair, across the desk where she had written her letters, across the walls lined with photographs of our life together. I set the box on the desk and stared at it for a long moment, my heart pounding. Inside, I found 2 items, a USB drive and a sealed envelope with my name written on the front in Margaret's familiar handwriting. My hands trembled as I reached for the envelope first. The paper was cream-colored, the kind she had always preferred, and the seal was unbroken. She had written this knowing I would not read it for years, perhaps never, depending on how our lives unfolded. I opened it carefully, as if the paper itself were fragile, and unfolded the letter inside. "My darling Franklin," she had written. "If you're reading this, then I was right about her. I'm sorry I could not tell you while I was alive. I had no proof, only instinct. But a woman knows when another woman is hunting. I saw the way Vanessa looked at you at our home, at everything we built. There was no love in her eyes, only calculation. I wanted to warn you, but you would have asked for evidence and I had none to give, so I prepared instead. Watch the video. Trust Evelyn. And remember, this kindness without boundaries is just weakness wearing a gentle face. You have always been kind, Franklin. It is one of the things I love most about you. But kindness must have limits, or it becomes an invitation for others to take advantage. Do not let your good heart be the weapon she uses against you. Fight back, my love. I will be watching." The letter was signed with her name, and beneath it a small drawing of a rose, the same roses she had planted in our garden 40 years ago. I pressed the paper to my chest and let myself weep alone in the study where we had spent so many evenings together, where her presence still lingered in every corner. When the tears subsided, I reached for the USB drive. My old laptop sat on the desk, and I plugged the drive in with fingers that still shook. A single video file appeared on the screen. I clicked it and held my breath. Margaret appeared before me. She was thin, painfully thin, her face pale and drawn from the illness that was slowly taking her, but her eyes were sharp, bright, filled with the determination I had loved since the day we met. She had recorded this during her final months when everyone thought she was too weak to do anything but sleep and wait for the end. Everyone had been wrong. "Hello, Franklin," she said, her voice soft but steady. "If Evelyn has given you this, then Vanessa has shown her true colors. I saw it from the beginning, the way she looked at our ranch, our savings, our life, like a blueprint for theft. I did not have proof, but I trusted my instincts, and I prepared for the worst." She shifted slightly in her chair, and I could see the effort it took for her to sit upright. "I have set up protections through the trust," she continued, Evelyn knows the details, but legal documents only do so much. You will need courage, patience, and evidence. Gather everything you can, document every suspicious action, build your case piece by piece, and do not let anger guide you. Let truth be your weapon. I watched the video once crying. I watched it a second time, listening more carefully to every word. By the third viewing, I was no longer crying. I had a notebook open beside me, and I was taking notes, writing down everything Margaret said, every piece of advice, every strategy she suggested. She had given me a roadmap from beyond the grave, and I intended to follow it. The video was nearly over when Margaret leaned forward, her eyes staring directly into the camera, as if she could see me sitting here 3 years in the future. When you expose her, Franklin, and you will make sure she exposes herself. People like Vanessa cannot help but reveal who they really are when they think they are about to lose. Give her that moment. Corner her, pressure her, let her believe she has lost everything, and then let her own words be her prison. She paused, and a smile crossed her face, that familiar smile I had fallen in love with so many decades ago. "I love you," she whispered. "Now go make her pay." Margaret's words stayed with me through the night and into the following days. Make her pay. Let her own words be her prison. My wife had seen this coming years before it happened, had prepared for a battle she knew she would not live to fight. Now it was my turn to finish what she started. I spent 2 days with Evelyn, carefully preparing the documents that would spring the trap. She understood exactly what I needed, papers that looked like a property transfer at first glance, but were actually something else entirely. The language was deliberately confusing, full of legal terminology and references that would seem routine to someone skimming quickly. Only a careful reader would notice that the recipient was not Lucas Moore, but the Colorado Veterans Foundation. Margaret had always said that if we had no worthy heirs, the ranch should go to those who had truly sacrificed. On the third day, I called a family meeting. Vanessa arrived with barely concealed anticipation, her eyes bright and hungry. She had dressed carefully, professionally, as if this were a business closing rather than a family gathering. Lucas trailed behind her, his face pale and drawn. He had not spoken to me since our conversation on the porch, since he had handed over the notebook that documented his wife's crimes. I wondered if he knew what was about to happen. I wondered if he even cared anymore. I made sure to look worse than ever. My hands shook as I poured coffee, spilling some on the tablecloth. My voice came out uncertain, wavering, the voice of a man losing his grip on reality. I asked Vanessa to repeat herself twice, squinting, as if I could not quite focus on her face. I saw her exchange a glance with Lucas, a look of triumph that she did not bother to hide. "I have been thinking," I said slowly, letting each word drag as if forming thoughts had become difficult. "About what you said, Vanessa. About the ranch." She leaned forward, her whole body tense with anticipation. "Yes, Franklin, you are right." I let my shoulders slump, let my head bow slightly. "This place is too much for me now. I cannot manage it alone. Margaret is gone, and I'm just a tired old man who cannot even remember where he put his glasses." I paused, swallowing hard as if the words were painful to speak. "I want to make sure the ranch goes to family. I want to do the right thing before it is too late." Vanessa's face transformed. The mask of concern she usually wore slipped away, replaced by naked greed and satisfaction. She looked like a woman who had just won the lottery, like someone whose every scheme had finally paid off. "Oh, Franklin," she breathed. "That is so wise of you, so brave." I reached into my jacket pocket and produced the documents Evelyn and I had prepared. My hands trembled as I held them out, and Vanessa nearly snatched them from my grip. She began flipping through the pages immediately, her eyes scanning the text with barely contained excitement. But she was not reading. Not really. She was seeing what she expected to see, what she wanted to see. Signatures on the designated lines. Dates filled in properly. Official letterhead from a legitimate law firm. The words "property transfer" caught her eye, and she didn't bother to look further. She didn't notice that the transfer was to an organization, not an individual. She didn't see the Colorado Veterans Foundation listed as the recipient. She saw victory, and that was all she needed. "This is wonderful, Franklin," she said, clutching the documents to her chest. "You have made the right decision. We will take such good care of everything, I promise you. The ranch will stay in the family. You have nothing to worry about anymore." She crossed the room and embraced me. It was the first physical affection she had shown me in years, perhaps ever. Her arms wrapped around my shoulders, and I could feel her trembling with excitement, with the thrill of finally claiming the prize she had been hunting for so long. I patted her back weakly, playing my part to the end. "You will not regret this, Dad," she whispered near my ear. The word Dad sounded strange coming from her lips, a term of endearment she had never used before. "I'm sure I will not," I replied. Lucas watched the entire scene without moving, without speaking. His face was unreadable, but I noticed his eyes flicker to the documents in his wife's hands, then to me, then away. He knew something was wrong. He could sense the trap, even if he could not see it. But he said nothing, did nothing true to form, until the very end. After they left, I sat alone in the living room and let the mask fall away. My hands stopped trembling. My posture straightened. The confused old man vanished, replaced by someone else entirely. A rancher who had spent 40 years building something worth protecting, a widower who had been handed a mission by the woman he loved, a father who had been betrayed but refused to be defeated. The sun was setting by the time Walter found me on the porch. He climbed the steps slowly, his boots heavy on the wooden boards, and stood beside me, looking out at the mountains Margaret and I had watched together for 4 decades. "The toxicology results came back," he said quietly. I didn't turn to look at him. I kept my eyes on the horizon, on the last rays of light painting the sky in shades of orange and red. "What did they find?" Walter's voice was grim. "The compound in your tea causes gradual heart failure. It builds up in the system over time, damages the heart muscle. Slowly makes death look natural, almost impossible to detect in a standard autopsy unless you know exactly what you're looking for." He paused, and I heard him take a deep breath. "It is the exact same compound that killed Robert Dawson 8 years ago. The toxicologist confirmed it. Whatever she used on him, she is using on you." I nodded slowly, feeling the pieces fall into place. We had the notebook. We had the recordings. We had the toxicology report linking Vanessa to a previous death, and we had documents that would reveal her greed the moment they were read aloud in front of witnesses. "Then we have everything we need," I said. "Call Evelyn. It is time for the reading." The next morning, I drove to Evelyn's office before dawn. The town was still asleep. Streetlights casting orange pools on empty sidewalks, and I was grateful for the solitude. What we were about to do required focus, precision, and a clear head unclouded by emotion. Margaret had given me the strategy. Now it was time to execute it. Evelyn was already waiting when I arrived. She led me to a conference room at the back of her office, a space she called her war room. The long table in the center was covered with documents, photographs, and folders arranged in meticulous order. Walter arrived shortly after, carrying the toxicology report in a sealed envelope. He set it down with the gravity of a man delivering a verdict. For the next 3 hours, we assembled our case. The toxicology report sat at the center of the table, the scientific proof that Vanessa had been slowly poisoning me. The compound was rare, expensive, and nearly impossible to detect without knowing exactly what to look for. It attacked the heart muscle, gradually mimicking the symptoms of natural cardiac decline. Perfect for making murder look like old age. Beside it lay Lucas's notebook. 2 years of documentation in my son's shaky handwriting. Dates and times of suspicious behavior. Transcripts of overheard phone calls, photographs of documents Vanessa had tried to hide. Each entry was another link in the chain that would bind her. The phone recordings came next, my own voice frail and confused, asking questions I already knew the answers to. And Vanessa's voice confident and cold, telling someone on the other end that everything was on schedule, that the old man was losing it fast, that they would have full control by spring. Finally, Evelyn produced a folder she had compiled over the past 2 weeks, Robert Dawson's medical records obtained through contacts she declined to name. Financial statements showing how his $800,000 estate had been systematically drained through investments Vanessa had recommended. A timeline of his decline that matched almost exactly the timeline of my own symptoms. She spread the documents across the table and looked at me with an expression that was equal parts satisfaction and solemnity. "Franklin," she said, "we have attempted murder on you, documented and provable through toxicology. We have strong circumstantial evidence linking Vanessa to Robert Dawson's death 8 years ago. We have a documented conspiracy through Lucas's notebook, showing she planned this for at least 2 years. And we have her own voice on recordings admitting to the scheme in her own words. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. This is not just a civil matter anymore. This is criminal. We are talking about attempted murder, possibly a previous murder, fraud, and conspiracy. If we do this right, Vanessa will spend the rest of her life in prison. Walter nodded grimly. So what is the plan? Evelyn outlined what she had arranged. A formal trust reading would be held at the ranch on Saturday afternoon. Ostensibly, this was to finalize the property transfer that Vanessa believed she had won. She would arrive expecting a celebration, expecting to hear legal confirmation that the ranch was now hers. Instead, she would walk into a trap. Detective Morrison from the county sheriff's office would be present along with 2 deputies. Evelyn had briefed him on the evidence, and he had agreed to observe the reading in person. A court reporter would document everything said in the room, creating an official transcript that could be used in court. Several witnesses would also attend, including Walter and 2 of Evelyn's associates. The key, Evelyn explained, is Margaret's video. We will play it at the reading. Let Vanessa see that her mother-in-law knew exactly what she was from the very beginning. Then I will reveal that the documents Franklin signed do not transfer the ranch to Lucas. They donate it to the Colorado Veterans Foundation. She leaned forward, her eyes sharp. Based on everything you have told me about Vanessa, and based on what Margaret wrote in her letter, this woman cannot control her temper when she feels cornered. She has spent years maintaining a mask of composure, but underneath that mask is rage. When she realizes she is lost, when she understands that she has been outmaneuvered, that mask will shatter. Margaret's words echoed in my mind. Let her expose herself. People like Vanessa cannot help but reveal who they really are when they think they are about to lose. We are counting on her to confess, I said quietly. Not confess, Evelyn corrected. Explode. Say things she cannot take back in front of witnesses and law enforcement. Her own words will become the final nail in her coffin. The plan was elegant, almost poetic. Vanessa had tried to destroy me with patience and deception. Now those same tools would be turned against her. But one question still gnawed at me, one concern I could not set aside no matter how hard I tried. What about Lucas? I asked. The room went quiet. Walter looked away, and Evelyn's expression softened with something that might have been sympathy. That is your call, Franklin, she said gently. His notebook is crucial to our case. It proves premeditation and shows the full scope of the conspiracy. The prosecutor will want him as a witness against Vanessa. If he cooperates fully, testifies truthfully, there is a good chance he will avoid serious charges. He was complicit, yes, but he was also clearly acting under duress and fear. She paused. Beyond the legal questions, he is still your son. What happens to your relationship after this is something only you can decide. I thought about Lucas on the porch, weeping as he handed me the notebook. I thought about the fear in his eyes, the years of weakness and wrong choices. He had failed me in ways that might never heal. But he had also, in his own cowardly way, tried to leave a record of the truth. He had documented his wife's crimes when he lacked the courage to stop them. He will testify, I said finally, and after that we will see. Evelyn nodded and reached for her phone. She dialed a number from memory and waited. When the line connected, her voice was calm and professional. Detective Morrison. This is Evelyn Hart. Saturday 2 p.m. at the Moore Ranch. Bring backup and bring handcuffs. You are about to witness a confession. Saturday arrived with the kind of clear blue sky that seemed to mock the darkness about to unfold beneath it. I woke before dawn and walked through the ranch one last time, touching the fence posts Margaret and I had set together, breathing in the smell of hay and horses and the land we had built our lives upon. By the time the sun was fully up, I was ready. The living room had been transformed. Walter and I had rearranged the furniture the night before, pushing Margaret's comfortable chairs against the walls and setting up a long table in the center of the room. It looked less like a family gathering and more like a courtroom, which was exactly the point. Evelyn arrived first, carrying her briefcase and a small projector. She sat up at the head of the table with the calm efficiency of someone who had done this 100 times before. Detective Morrison came next, a tall man in his 50s with gray at his temples and eyes that missed nothing. He wore plain clothes rather than a uniform, and when Evelyn introduced him as a friend of the family, he simply nodded and took a seat in the corner of the room. His presence was meant to be unobtrusive, forgettable, until the moment it was not. The court reporter arrived shortly after, a young woman with quick fingers who set up her stenography equipment without a word. 2 of Evelyn's associates positioned themselves near the door, witnesses who would later testify to everything that happened in this room. Walter stood by the window, his arms crossed, his eyes fixed on the driveway. "They are here," he said quietly. I watched through the curtains as Vanessa's car pulled up to the house. She emerged first, dressed impeccably, her hair perfect, her smile already in place. She looked like a woman arriving to collect a prize she had already won. Lucas followed behind her, his movements hesitant, his face pale. He knew something was wrong. He could feel the trap even if he could not see its shape. They entered the living room and stopped short. Vanessa's eyes swept across the formal arrangement, the strangers seated around the table, the court reporter with her fingers poised above the keys. For just a moment, uncertainty flickered across her face. Then she recovered, smoothing her expression into pleasant confusion. "Franklin," she said, her voice light and questioning, "what is all this? I thought we were just finalizing the paperwork." "We are," I replied, keeping my voice neutral. "Evelyn thought it would be best to do things properly, make sure everything is documented correctly." Vanessa glanced at Evelyn, then at the detective in the corner. "Who is he?" "A friend of the family," Evelyn said smoothly. "Please sit down. We have a lot to cover." Vanessa hesitated, her instincts clearly warning her that something was off, but greed won out over caution. She had come too far, waited too long to walk away now. She sat down across from me, and Lucas took the chair beside her. His hands were trembling. Evelyn opened her briefcase and removed a thick folder of documents. She spread them across the table with deliberate slowness, letting the tension build. The court reporter's fingers began to move, recording every word. "We are here today." Evelyn began, her voice formal and precise, to review the provisions of the trust established by Margaret Moore before her death and to clarify the status of the property known as the Moore Ranch. Vanessa leaned forward slightly, her eyes hungry. Evelyn continued. "Margaret Moore established this revocable living trust with the following provisions. First, regarding the matter of incapacity. In the event that Franklin Moore is declared mentally incompetent by a court of law, control of all assets held within this trust transfers not to family members, but to the designated successor trustee." She paused and looked directly at Vanessa. "That successor trustee is myself, Evelyn Hart, not Lucas Moore, not any family member, me." The color drained from Vanessa's face. Her carefully constructed smile faltered, then froze in place like a mask that no longer fit. I watched her process the information, watched her realize that her entire guardianship scheme had been worthless from the start. Even if she had succeeded in having me declared incompetent, she would have gained nothing. Margaret had seen to that years ago. Furthermore, Evelyn continued, the trust contains a no-contest clause. Any beneficiary who engages in fraud, coercion, or criminal activity against Franklin Moore automatically forfeits all inheritance rights, completely and irrevocably. Vanessa's hands began to shake. She gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles white, her jaw clenched so tight I could see the muscles jumping beneath her skin. Beside her, Lucas stared at the floor, unable to meet anyone's eyes. Evelyn let the silence stretch for a long moment. Then she reached into her briefcase and removed a USB drive. "Before we continue," she said, "there is something else. Margaret wanted her husband to see this. She recorded a message before her death with specific instructions that it be played at this reading." She connected the drive to the projector and aimed it at the white wall behind her. The screen flickered to life, and suddenly Margaret was there. My wife, thin and pale from illness, but with eyes that blazed with determination, looking directly at the camera, directly at the room, directly at Vanessa. "Hello, Vanessa," Margaret said, her voice clear and steady despite her frailty. "If you are watching this, then you have done exactly what I predicted." The room went utterly still. Vanessa stared at the screen, her face a mask of shock and dawning horror. Margaret continued speaking, her words calm and measured, explaining how she had seen through Vanessa from the very beginning, how she had prepared for this moment even as cancer consumed her body. I watched Vanessa's composure crack. Watched the mask she had worn for years begin to splinter. Her breathing grew rapid and shallow. Her fingers dug into the table hard enough to leave marks in the wood. And then she broke. Vanessa leapt to her feet, her chair crashing backward onto the floor. "This is insane," she shouted, her voice shrill and desperate. "That woman was senile when she recorded this. She was dying. She did not know what she was saying. You cannot use this against me. You cannot prove anything. This is all just the ramblings of a sick old woman who—" Evelyn raised her hand calmly, and something in her expression made Vanessa stop mid-sentence. The detective in the corner shifted slightly, his attention now fully focused on the woman standing before us. "I am not finished, Mrs. Moore." Evelyn said, her voice cold as ice. "Please sit down. The next part concerns your stepfather, Robert Dawson." The name Robert Dawson landed in the room like a thunderclap. Vanessa froze mid-motion, her body rigid, her face cycling through emotions too quickly to track. Fear, confusion, calculation, and beneath it all, the first crack of genuine terror. She lowered herself back into her chair slowly, as if her legs could no longer support her weight. Evelyn did not wait for her to recover. She reached into her folder and withdrew a stack of documents, laying them on the table one by one with the precision of a surgeon. 3 weeks ago, she began, her voice calm and relentless. "I contacted the medical examiner's office in the county where Robert Dawson died. Based on new evidence suggesting foul play, they agreed to reopen the investigation. Tissue samples that had been preserved from the original autopsy were retested using more advanced methods." She slid the first document across the table. "The toxicology report, Mrs. Moore. The same rare compound that was found in the tea you gave Franklin was present in Robert Dawson's system. The exact same compound. Rare, expensive, nearly undetectable unless you know precisely what to look for. It causes gradual heart failure that mimics natural cardiac decline." Vanessa's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Her eyes darted to the document, then to Evelyn, then to me. She looked like an animal searching for an escape route and finding none. "That is not possible," she finally managed, her voice thin and strained. "Robert had a heart condition. Everyone knew that." Evelyn shook her head slowly. "His medical records show no history of heart problems whatsoever. He passed a complete physical examination 3 months before his death with perfect results. There was nothing wrong with his heart until someone made something wrong with it." She produced the next piece of evidence. "This is Lucas Moore's notebook, 2 years of documentation written in his own hand detailing your plans against Franklin. Dates, conversations, suspicious activities, photographs of documents you tried to hide. Your own husband has been keeping a record of everything you have done." Vanessa turned to Lucas with an expression of pure venom. He shrank back in his chair, unable to meet her eyes, his face pale as death. The betrayal she saw there seemed to stun her, almost as much as the evidence itself. "I can explain." Vanessa started, her voice rising. "That notebook is fabricated. Lucas is obviously disturbed. He has been unstable for years. You cannot trust anything he—" Evelyn cut her off by pressing play on a small recording device. Vanessa's own voice filled the room, confident and cold, captured weeks ago during a phone call she thought no one could hear. "Everything is on schedule. The old man is losing it fast. By spring, we will have full control." The court reporter's fingers flew across her keys, capturing every word. Detective Morrison sat motionless in the corner, his expression unreadable, but his eyes never left Vanessa's face. "That was taken out of context," Vanessa said quickly, desperately. "I was talking about his care about making sure he was looked after properly. You are twisting my words." Evelyn remained unmoved. "Would you like me to play the rest of it? The part where you discuss having him declared incompetent? The part where you calculate how long it will take to gain full control of his assets?" Vanessa's denials were growing weaker with each passing moment. Her composure, so carefully maintained for years, was crumbling before our eyes. She looked from face to face around the room, searching for sympathy, for doubt, for any crack she might exploit. She found nothing but cold judgment. And then Evelyn played the final card. "There is one more thing, Mrs. Moore," she said, her voice almost gentle now, the gentleness of someone delivering a killing blow. "The documents Franklin signed last week, the ones you celebrated so enthusiastically, the ones you believe transferred ownership of this ranch to your husband." She paused, letting the moment stretch. Vanessa leaned forward, her last hope flickering in her eyes. Those documents were not a transfer to Lucas. They were a charitable donation to the Colorado Veterans Foundation. Every acre, every building, every dollar of value. Franklin signed his ranch over to veterans, not to you. She slid the documents across the table, pointing to the relevant passages. "You were so eager to claim your prize that you did not bother to read the fine print. You saw what you wanted to see and nothing else. You have nothing, Mrs. Moore. You never had anything." For a moment, Vanessa sat perfectly still. The silence in the room was absolute. I could hear the tick of the grandfather clock in the hallway, the distant sound of horses in the pasture, the scratch of the court reporter's fingers pausing on her keys. And then Vanessa exploded. She launched herself to her feet, her chair flying backward, her face contorted with rage unlike anything I had ever seen. 2 years of manipulation, planning, and patience shattered in an instant, revealing the monster that had always lurked beneath the polished surface. "That ranch was supposed to be mine," she screamed, her voice raw and primal. "I worked for this. I earned this. I waited years for that old man to die, just like—" She stopped. The words hung in the air, incomplete but unmistakable. The room was frozen, every person holding their breath, waiting. Detective Morrison rose slowly from his chair in the corner. His movement was calm, deliberate, the movement of a man who had just heard exactly what he needed to hear. "Just like who, Mrs. Moore?" he asked, his voice quiet but carrying clearly through the silent room. "Just like Robert Dawson, your stepfather." Vanessa's face went white. The rage drained out of her like water from a broken vessel, replaced by something I had never seen in her before, pure, naked terror. She looked at the detective, at the witnesses, at the court reporter whose fingers had captured every word, and for the first time in her life, she had no manipulation left, no scheme to fall back on, no escape route to exploit. She opened her mouth, but nothing came out. The woman who had always had an answer for everything stood speechless, undone by her own words. Detective Morrison reached into his jacket and produced a pair of handcuffs. The metal caught the afternoon light streaming through the windows. "Vanessa Moore," he said, his voice formal and final, "you are under arrest for the attempted murder of Franklin Moore. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." He crossed the room and took her wrist. She did not resist. She seemed incapable of resistance, her body limp, her eyes empty. And based on what we have heard today, the detective continued as he secured the cuffs. "We will be reopening the investigation into Robert Dawson's death. You may want to contact an attorney." The deputies who had been waiting outside entered the room and took Vanessa by the arms. As they led her toward the door, she turned and looked back at Lucas. The hatred in her eyes was absolute, burning with a fury that transcended words. "This is your fault," she hissed, her voice dripping with venom. "You and your pathetic little notebook. I should have known you were too weak to keep your mouth shut. You ruined everything." Lucas said nothing. He sat motionless in his chair, his hands folded in his lap, watching his wife being led away in handcuffs. And as the front door closed behind her, as the sound of the police car starting echoed through the quiet house, I saw something shift in my son's expression. For the first time in years, he looked almost relieved. The police car had been gone for nearly an hour before anyone spoke. Evelyn gathered her documents quietly, exchanging a few words with Detective Morrison's deputies before they departed. The court reporter packed up her equipment and left without ceremony. Walter stood watch by the window until the last vehicle disappeared down the driveway, then retreated to his quarters with a nod that said everything words could not. One by one, they all left and the house grew still. I found Lucas in the living room, sitting exactly where he had been when they took Vanessa away. He had not moved, had not spoken, had barely seemed to breathe. His head was bowed, his face buried in his hands, his shoulders curved inward like a man trying to make himself small enough to disappear. The afternoon light had shifted while we sat through the reading, and now long shadows stretched across the floor, reaching toward him like fingers. I stood in the doorway and watched my son. Part of me wanted to feel rage, wanted to storm across the room and demand to know how he could have let this happen, how he could have watched his wife try to murder his own father and done nothing but scribble notes in a leather book. But the rage would not come. Looking at Lucas now, I did not see a villain. I saw a broken man who had made cowardly choices and was only beginning to understand the weight of them. I crossed the room slowly, my footsteps heavy on the hardwood floor. Lucas did not look up as I approached, did not acknowledge my presence until I lowered myself into the chair across from him. We sat in silence for a long moment, father and son separated by a gulf that might never fully close. When I finally spoke, my voice was quieter than I expected. "You have to testify against her, Lucas. Everything you wrote in that notebook, everything you saw and heard over the past 2 years, the prosecutor will need all of it." Lucas raised his head. His eyes were red-rimmed, his face haggard with exhaustion and shame. He looked like he had aged 10 years in the past few hours. "I will," he said, his voice hoarse. "I will tell them everything. Every conversation, every phone call, every time I watched her and did nothing. It is the least I can—" He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. The The words hung incomplete in the air between us. "The least you can do," I said, completing his thought. "Yes, it is the least." He flinched as if I had struck him, but he did not argue. He knew I was right. We both knew that testifying against Vanessa was not redemption, not forgiveness, not even the beginning of making things right. It was simply the minimum requirement of basic human decency, the floor beneath which he could not sink any lower. The silence stretched between us again. Outside, I could hear the horses moving in the pasture, the wind rustling through Margaret's roses, the ordinary sounds of a ranch that had nearly been stolen from me by the woman my son had married. Life continuing on despite everything. Lucas finally broke the quiet. "Dad," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I know you must hate me." I considered the word carefully before responding. "Hate is not what I feel, Lucas. I feel disappointed. I feel betrayed. I feel a grief that goes deeper than I know how to express, because the son I raised should have been better than this, but hate. No, I do not hate you." He looked up at me with something desperate in his eyes. "Can you forgive me?" I let the question sit for a moment, giving it the weight it deserved. The honest answer was complicated, more complicated than a simple yes or no could capture. Forgiveness was not a switch I could flip, not a decision I could make in an afternoon and have done with. It was a process, a journey, and I did not yet know where that journey would lead. "I cannot forgive you yet," I said finally. "You watched her try to kill me for months, Lucas. You knew what she was doing. You saw the evidence with your own eyes, and you did nothing. You were scared. I understand that. She is a frightening woman, and fear makes people do things they would never do otherwise. But understanding is not the same as forgiveness. Understanding is recognizing why you made the choices you made. Forgiveness is accepting those choices and moving past them. I'm not there yet. I do not know if I ever will be." Lucas nodded slowly, tears sliding down his cheeks. He did not try to defend himself, did not offer excuses or explanations. He simply accepted my words as the truth they were. "What happens now?" he asked quietly. I thought about the question for a long moment before answering. "What happens now is that you rebuild," I said. "Not for me, not for this ranch. For yourself. You have spent years living under the shadow of that woman, letting her make your decisions, letting her turn you into someone your mother would not recognize. That ends today." I leaned forward, making sure he met my eyes. "Start by being the man your mother believed you could be. She never stopped loving you, Lucas, even when she saw what Vanessa was doing to you. She believed there was still something good inside you, something worth saving. Prove her right. It was not reconciliation. It was not an embrace or a declaration that all was forgiven. But it was not condemnation either. It was a door left slightly open, a possibility that things might someday be different than they were today. What Lucas did with that possibility was up to him. He stood slowly, wiping his face with the back of his hand. His movements were uncertain, like a man learning to walk again after a long illness. "I should go," he said. I do not know. I need to figure out what comes next." I walked him to the door and watched as he made his way down the porch steps toward his car. The sun was beginning to set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and red, the same colors Margaret and I had watched together for 40 years. Just as Lucas reached for his car door, I called out, "Lucas, wait." He stopped his hand on the handle but didn't turn around. "Your mother's video," I said, "the one Evelyn played at the reading. That was not the only message she recorded. She made a separate one for you, something she wanted you to hear privately. I was not going to give it to you, not after everything that happened, but maybe you should hear what she had to say." Lucas stood motionless for a long moment. I could see the tension in his shoulders, the struggle playing out beneath the surface. Finally, quietly, he spoke. "Not yet, Dad. I have not earned that yet." He opened the car door and climbed inside. I watched him drive away the dust from his tires rising in the evening light until the car disappeared around the bend in the road and the ranch was quiet once more. I stood on the porch for a long time after he left, thinking about everything that had happened, everything that was still to come. Lucas had a long road ahead of him, a road of courtrooms and testimony and the slow, painful work of becoming someone new. But he had taken the first step. He had acknowledged that he needed to earn his way back, that forgiveness was not something given freely, but something built through action and time. Maybe I thought as the stars began to emerge in the darkening sky, there is hope for him after all. 3 months passed before justice was fully served. The wheels of the legal system turned slowly, but they turned with inexorable certainty, grinding Vanessa's carefully constructed life into dust. The trial itself was swift. Vanessa's outburst at the reading had been recorded by the court reporter, every word captured and preserved for the prosecution. Her own voice screaming that she had waited years for the old man to die became the centerpiece of the case against her. Combined with the toxicology reports, the phone recordings, and the mountain of documentation Lucas had compiled, the defense had almost nothing to work with. Her attorney tried to argue emotional distress, tried to suggest that the evidence had been fabricated or taken out of context, but the jury saw through every attempt. Lucas took the stand and testified for 2 full days. His notebook was entered as Exhibit A, its pages projected onto screens for the jury to examine in detail. He answered every question with quiet honesty, describing what he had seen and heard over the past 2 years, admitting his own cowardice without excuse or justification. When the prosecutor asked why he had not come forward sooner, Lucas simply said he had been afraid, and the shame in his voice was genuine enough to convince even the most skeptical juror. I attended every day of the trial. I sat in the gallery and watched as the woman who had tried to murder me was methodically dismantled by evidence and testimony. She looked different in the courtroom, smaller somehow, diminished. The confidence that had defined her was gone, replaced by a brittle defensiveness that cracked a little more with each passing witness. The verdict came on a Thursday afternoon: guilty of attempted murder in the first degree, guilty of conspiracy to commit fraud. The judge scheduled sentencing for the following month, but everyone in the courtroom knew what was coming: 15 years minimum. And that was before the additional charges. The investigation into Robert Dawson's death had been officially reopened based on the evidence presented at the reading. Tissue samples that had been preserved from the original autopsy were retested using the same methods that had exposed the poison in my tea. The results were conclusive. Robert Dawson had been murdered with the same compound Vanessa had used on me, administered slowly over months until his heart simply gave out. Additional charges were pending, and the prosecutor told Evelyn privately that Vanessa would likely spend the rest of her life behind bars. Lucas filed for divorce the week after the verdict. The proceedings were uncontested. Vanessa had nothing left to fight with, no leverage to exploit, no schemes left to execute. Under the no-contest clause of Margaret's trust, Lucas had forfeited all inheritance rights the moment his involvement in Vanessa's conspiracy became public record. The ranch would never be his. But I could not abandon my son entirely, despite everything he had done, despite the betrayal and the cowardice. He was still my blood, still the child Margaret and I had raised and loved. I arranged for a modest monthly allowance through Evelyn's office, enough for Lucas to live simply while he rebuilt his life. He moved into a small apartment in town and began volunteering at the Colorado Veterans Foundation, the same organization that had nearly inherited the ranch as part of my trap. It was not forgiveness. It was not reconciliation. But it was a chance, and what Lucas did with it was up to him. One afternoon in late spring, a car I did not recognize pulled up the driveway. I was on the porch with Walter when a woman emerged, tall and slender, with dark hair touched by gray at the temples. She walked toward us with purpose, her eyes fixed on my face, and when she reached the steps, she stopped and simply stared. "Mr. Moore," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I'm Sarah Green, Walter's daughter." I rose slowly from my chair, memories flooding back, the fire of '94, the smoke and the flames, and the child screaming in the hayloft. I had not seen her since she was 8 years old, carried unconscious from the burning barn, her small body limp in my arms. She crossed the remaining distance between us and wrapped her arms around me, holding tight as tears streamed down her face. "My father told me what you did for him," she whispered against my shoulder. "What you did for me 30 years ago. I'm a doctor now. I save lives every day. And none of it would have been possible if you had not run into that fire." I held her and let her cry, my own eyes burning with tears I did not try to hide. Walter stood nearby, watching his daughter embrace the man who had given her back to him, and for once, his stoic expression cracked into something that looked almost like peace. The ranch was safe. Evelyn remained the designated successor trustee, ready to step in if anything ever happened to me. But I was in full control of everything Margaret and I had built together. The charitable donation documents had been voided the day after the reading their purpose served. The trap had worked exactly as planned, and now the land would remain in my hands until I decided otherwise. That evening I sat on the porch with Walter, watching the sun set over the mountains Margaret had loved so much. The sky blazed with color orange and red and purple fading into the deep blue of approaching night. The horses were quiet in the pasture, and somewhere in the distance a coyote called to its pack. "You did it, boss," Walter said quietly, his voice carrying the satisfaction of a battle finally won. I shook my head slowly, my eyes still fixed on the horizon. "No, Margaret did it. I just finished what she started." Walter smiled, the expression softening his weathered features. She would be proud. I looked at her roses blooming red in the fading light, their petals catching the last rays of the sun. I know she would. 6 months after the trial, I woke before dawn as I always did, but something had changed. The silence that had once felt oppressive now felt peaceful. The emptiness that had haunted every corner of the house had softened into something gentler, something that left room for memory without drowning in grief. I made my coffee and carried it out to Margaret's rose garden, the morning ritual I had performed for years. The roses were thriving, their red blooms bright against the green leaves drinking in the first golden light of sunrise. I talked to her as I watered them, telling her about the ranch, about the horses, about the small victories and ordinary moments that made up a life. But now, instead of speaking into a void, I felt like she was listening. The loneliness was still there, but it no longer consumed me. I had found something I had not expected to find at 69 years old: purpose. Every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon, I drove to the Colorado Veterans Foundation and taught free workshops to young veterans trying to find their way back into civilian life. Basic repairs at first, the kind of skills every homeowner should know. Then, construction fundamentals, ranch management, the practical knowledge I had accumulated over 4 decades of working the land. The classes started small, just a handful of uncertain young men and women sitting in folding chairs. But word spread quickly. Evelyn visited one afternoon and watched me demonstrate how to mend a fence post to a group of veterans who had served in places I could barely pronounce. Afterward, she pulled me aside, her expression thoughtful. "You are not just teaching them to fix fences," she said. "You are teaching them to fix themselves." She was right. These young people had seen things no one should see, had done things that left invisible scars on their souls. They came to my workshops feeling broken and purposeless, and they left with calluses on their hands and something like hope in their eyes. I could not heal what the war had done to them, but I could give them skills, give them confidence, give them proof that they were still capable of building something good. Lucas wrote to me from the recovery center where he had been working on himself for the past 4 months. The letters arrived every few weeks, short and humble, asking nothing. He wrote about the therapy sessions he was attending, the amends he was trying to make, the slow and painful process of becoming someone worth forgiving. He never asked for my forgiveness directly. He seemed to understand that it was not his to request. I did not respond to the letters. I was not ready for that yet, not ready to open a dialogue that might lead somewhere I could not predict. But I saved every one of them in Margaret's old jewelry box, the one that sat on her dresser where she had kept her most precious things. Maybe someday I would read them again. Maybe someday I would write back. One evening I sat alone in my study and watched Margaret's video one last time. Her face filled the screen, thin and pale, but fierce with determination, her eyes looking directly into mine across the years that separated us. I did not cry this time. I watched with gratitude instead of grief, marveling at the woman who had loved me enough to protect me even after death. Her love had outlasted her life. It had reached across 3 years of silence and saved me when I needed saving most. The next morning, I climbed to the highest point of the ranch, a ridge where Margaret and I used to watch storms roll in across the mountains. The land stretched out below me in every direction, 4,000 acres of grass and timber and memory. I thought about everything they had tried to take from me, not just the property, but my sanity, my dignity, my remaining years on this earth. They had failed. I stood there in the morning light and understood finally what I had reclaimed. It was not just a ranch. It was the proof that love does not end at death, that kindness repaid returns tenfold, and that an old man still has plenty of fight left in him. Below me, Margaret's roses were blooming red in the garden she had planted 40 years ago. I think that means she agrees. And that is where Franklin's story ends, but I want to take a moment to share some thoughts with you. This story hit me differently because it reminds us that the people who hurt us most are often the ones we invite into our lives with open arms. Vanessa did not break into Franklin's home with a weapon. She walked through the front door, with a smile, sat at his dinner table, and called him Dad while plotting his death. That is the most dangerous kind of enemy, the one wearing the mask of family. But here's what I want you to take away from this story. First, trust your instincts. Margaret saw through Vanessa years before anyone else did. She had no proof, just a feeling, and she acted on it. If someone in your life makes you uncomfortable, if something feels wrong, even when you cannot explain why, pay attention to that feeling. Your gut is trying to protect you. Second, prepare for the worst while hoping for the best. Margaret set up legal protections not because she wanted to control her husband from beyond the grave, but because she loved him enough to plan for dangers he could not see. Talk to a lawyer. Update your will. Make sure the people you trust have the tools they need to protect you if something happens. Third, never underestimate the value of loyalty. Walter waited 30 years to repay a debt Franklin had forgotten. One act of kindness in 1994 saved Franklin's life decades later. Be good to people. Help when you can. You never know when that kindness will come back to save you. And finally, remember, this age is not weakness. Franklin was supposed to be the victim, the confused old man too feeble to fight back. Instead, he outsmarted a predator half his age. Never let anyone convince you that your best days are behind you. Thank you for watching Revenge Room. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. I will see you in the next one.